So just last summer, I was out in California where I participated in a 5-day workshop for diversity trainers on facilitating conversations on difficult dialogues such as race. I joined a group of 23 other professionals from both the academic and the private sectors. Most were people of color, African Americans, several people from Asian and Latino backgrounds, one Native American. And out of all the participants, 8 were white Americans. The workshop was transformative for me, but not at all as a result of its intended purpose. Rather, a single statement uttered during the workshop catalyzed for me a significant moment in my own journey to understand the racial tyranny that for so long had been simmering, but which in the last 2 years has boiled over anew. You know of this racial tyranny. You know that more than 41 million Black Americans are victims of it on a daily basis. You know these names. You know that the list is longer and that it will continue to grow. Just 1 week before my training workshop, 9 African Americans were murdered in a church in Charleston, South Carolina. The perpetrator of this massacre, a 21-year-old self-identified white supremacist. This is a climate that envelops our country and that permeated the workshop atmosphere. It should come as no surprise, then, that chaos erupted on the second day of the workshop when a white male participant uttered the term, "tar baby." "Tar baby," the white man had said. He had said this without any seemingly ill intent to describe to us a previous innocuous interaction he had had with a Black woman. As you may know, Tar Baby is a tar-covered doll that Brer Fox used to ensnare Brer Rabbit in an 1881 Uncle Remus story. Today, this term is a metaphor for a sticky situation that is only aggravated by attempts to solve it. But Tar Baby has another meaning. It's a derogatory term for African Americans. At the workshop, a white man had just uttered "tar baby" to describe his interaction with a Black woman. And what we had in the room was silence. I felt a surge of blood come to my face. I looked at the 5 Black women in the room. They were shocked into quiet indignation. And all around them were looks of shame and discomfort. For the following hour, there were awkward attempts to move on with the training program. In between, though, even as the training program went on, there was silence. With my heartbeat pounding in my head, I silently demanded, "Will anyone in the room intervene or challenge the white man's use of tar baby?" And in fact, why hadn't I stood up and intervened? I was afraid that I would further disenfranchise the Black women in the room by speaking for them. There was something else, though. I expected that the white man or another white person in the room would speak up. Instead, there was silence. Why had the white people in the room remained silent, just like I had? Minutes passed. An hour passed. Nothing. I became increasingly agitated. Here we were, a group of people invested in racial justice, but not one of us had questioned the white man. Not one of us had had the courage to transform that oppressive silence into a moment for racial justice. Later, much later, the silence was broken. But it wasn't me who broke the silence. And it wasn't any of the white people in the room. It was a Black woman who spoke up. It was then that for several hours we addressed racism. And at moments, I couldn't help but cry. out of anger, out of utter frustration, out of a sense of hopelessness. You see, racism is not a problem created by Black people. Why then do we expect Black people to address and solve the problem of racism? As I cried, I became consumed by other questions. Why is it that when racial tyranny attacks white people, including allies, stay back and cover rather than advance and fight it? Why is it, I wanted to know, that white Americans don't feel injured or viscerally offended in the face of racism? I have some thoughts. Consider what John Mehta has shared with us. White Americans, he says, have the privilege to interact with the social and political structures of our society as individuals rather than as a collective or as a group. What do I mean by this? Let me explain with a concrete example. When a couple in the name of jihadist ideology murders 14 Americans in San Bernardino, California, white Americans call them terrorists. And as a result, they brand all Muslims terrorists and haters. Yet, when a 21-year-old white man acting on the ideology of white supremacy murders 9 Black Americans, white Americans call him a mentally ill individual. They neither condemn the ideology on which he was acting, nor label him a terrorist, not even when he himself confessed that he had committed the murders in hopes of fomenting a race war. Even then, the response on the part of white Americans was not that Americans are racist or that we live in a fundamentally racist society. Instead, they insisted that the massacre was a result of the singular actions of one racist individual who happened also to be very sick. Never mind that all the while, the Confederate flag, a symbol of segregation and Black oppression, was flying high over the South Carolina State House. Let me repeat. In the year 2015, a symbol of segregation and Black oppression was flying high over a government building. But here I ask that we reckon with another question. Why are so many white Americans focused on the depravity of the singular actions of an individual, but almost wholly blind to the racism embedded within the very institutions, the laws, and the policies of our society? John Mehta has offered us a possible answer. He comes back to this idea that it's convenient and comfortable for white Americans to behave as autonomous individuals and to explain racism at the level of the individual. In other words, as in I myself am not a racist. You see, white Americans begin with the assumption that they and that the United States of America in general are fundamentally good. And so the very suggestion that this country is racist at its core, they interpret as an attack on their personal character. For the most part, many white Americans don't differentiate their participation within a racist system from an accusation that they themselves are racist. Without making that distinction, white Americans in general choose not to acknowledge systemic racism. And instead, white Americans will often focus their energies on vigorously defending that they themselves are not racist. But whether or not white Americans are racist, or whether or not you personally see racism, it's there, deeply embedded. Racism exists in our country not because white people use racist labels like tar baby, welfare queen, thug, or the N-word. And it doesn't exist because of some kind of moral backwardness on the part of some individuals. Rather, and here's a radical idea, racism exists in our country because of white American silence. And every day, that silence allows racism to be reproduced. Disproportionate poverty rates among Blacks, the racial profiling that puts a vast number of our black and brown young males behind bars. Discriminatory housing practices, the very same ones that are responsible for breeding widespread violence. And a black life expectancy rate that is higher than that of whites. We've heard all this before, but for the most part, white Americans have remained conspicuously silent. So to white Americans, I say this: racism exists in our country today because of this silence. It exists because often the courage is lacking to look at the effects of centuries of deep-seated racial inequities. And to those of you who, like me, can perhaps pass as being white, I say this: racism exists in our country because of our silence. Our silence neither covers up our relief nor atones for our guilt at having escaped being treated in this country as the lowest of the lowest, all because of some freak chance of having been born with lighter skin. Yes, our individual and collective silence was the visceral realization I had on that day when the white man uttered, "Tar baby." So if the vast majority of us have been silent, how is it then that there's been any progress at all in terms of racial justice? That there's been any progress at all has to do with some Americans refusing to stay silent in the face of a racial tyranny that was not and is not now of their own making. And in not staying silent, they ushered in racial justice. Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, Malcolm X, Ella Baker, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr. As you know, most people who have reached any kind of legendary status in the struggle for racial justice are black. So where are white Americans when it comes to shouldering responsibility? You see, as a white American, you hold the key to dismantling racial tyranny. Imagine, from your unique position of racial power and privilege, you can work towards the equitable distribution of political power, healthcare, education, housing, income, and wealth. Let me be clear. I do not believe that systemic racial inequity is the fault of individual white Americans. But I do believe that you, as a white American, and collectively, have an awesome opportunity to be at the forefront of racial justice. Many more Winifred Greens, Peggy McIntoshes, and some say more John Browns are needed in order to confront and dismantle racism. So let's break the usual frame for a moment, the frame in which blacks are at the forefront of racial justice, and instead imagine this. Let's return to the workshop that I attended this past summer. When all was said and done, it was a black woman who spoke up when the white man said, "Tar baby." She transformed that moment into a moment for racial justice. But what if the person transforming that moment for racial justice had been one of the white men or women in the room? And think about this. Last July in South Carolina, a black woman by the name of Bree Newsome scaled a 30-foot pole and risked her life and her freedom to bring down the Confederate flag. Newsome had an accomplice, a white man by the name of James Ian Tyson, who stood quietly at the base of the pole holding the rope and offering his support. Later, Tyson publicly commented that it was decided that the role of climbing the pole would go to a black woman and the supportive role to a white man. Okay, so I get it. I get that the plan is for white allies to show support without dominating or taking over a movement. But here's the thing. It continues to let white Americans off the hook. It provides a cover for white Americans to remain in the background, quiet, silent. Over and over, I hear white people say things like, "I'm not going to try to lead a movement that isn't about me." But here's the thing, though. When it comes to dismantling racial tyranny, this movement is about you. So let's break the frame in which a black woman was the catalyst for racial justice. And instead, imagine that it was a white man scaling that pole at the state building to bring down a symbol of black oppression and terror created and preserved by white supremacy. Wow. Imagine, what would that have looked like? What message would it have sent to other white Americans in our country? Breaking the frame is not easy. It means, first of all, that we move away from thinking as an individual. You and I refuse, in other words, to talk about I, a racist. It means that you and I choose to notice and name racism as structural and systemic in nature. Once we let ourselves see it, it's there all the time. But breaking the frame means that we don't just simply allow ourselves to notice the spectacles of pain, but that you and I speak up. Don't let it slide. Don't stand there watching oppression, degradation, and discrimination in silence. Remember, silence, mine, yours, ours, reproduces racial tyranny. Yes, interrupting the racial tyranny will expose you and make you vulnerable. It will. But just imagine, in the process, you will simultaneously give rise to a new movement, one in which white people are the catalyst for racial justice. And here's the thing. White Americans benefit socially and materially from racial tyranny. But when you choose to become an interrupter rather than a silent bystander, you may just experience that you too have been harmed by that same racial tyranny. You may, very well, come to experience that you too are in need of liberation, and that your own liberation depends on racial justice. Thank you.